The night the Grayson children were found in 1987, the air over Briarwood carried a coldness that didn't belong to early autumn. Officers said the forest felt different that evening, quieter, heavier, as if something inside it was waiting. 3 days had passed since Ben, Lily, and Noah Grayson had vanished, and the town's hope was thinning like mist at sunrise. But when the children emerged from the tree line, barefoot, trembling, and clutching each other's hands, the nightmare didn't end. It began. The moment the youngest opened his mouth to speak, every official in the room felt an instinctive chill, the kind that presses into your bones like winter. What the Grayson children said about the woods, the voices, and the figures that followed them back would shatter every familiar shape of reality the town once knew. The disappearance of the Grayson children began like any ordinary afternoon in Briarwood, a town where nothing extraordinary had happened in decades, which is why no one paid much attention when the 3 siblings wandered toward the edge of the woods behind their aging farmhouse. Ben, the eldest at 12, had always been the brave one, leading his younger sister Lily and little brother Noah on small adventures through the fields, never straying far from home. That day, however, something felt different, though none of them could have explained it. The forest seemed unusually still, as if holding its breath, and the air carried a quiet tension that made even the birds hesitant to sing. Yet the children, in their innocent excitement, didn't notice the subtle wrongness settling around them like a thin fog. Their mother believed they were simply chasing dragonflies near the tall grass, as they often did, and she wasn't concerned when they didn't return right away. An hour passed, then 2, and an unsettling silence crept into the house. She called out for them from the back porch, her voice echoing across the yard and into the tree line, but no small voices answered. At sunset, her worry grew into a tight knot in her chest. By nightfall, it had turned into dread. When the sheriff's department was alerted, officers believed the children were likely lost, stuck somewhere in the woods, or hiding in a spot they couldn't find their way out of. Search teams gathered with flashlights and dogs, combing through the thick undergrowth, calling the children's names with patient confidence. But with each passing hour, the forest refused to give anything back. No footprints, no clothing, no broken branches suggesting movement. It was as if the Grayson children had stepped into the trees and dissolved into the night. Volunteers swarmed the area by morning, and helicopters hovered overhead, scanning the canopy for signs of movement. But the woods remained stubbornly silent. The absence of clues began to gnaw at everyone involved, leaving a strange, heavy feeling in their stomachs. Families in the town clutched their own children a little tighter, and whispers spread faster than the search teams could move. Some said the forest had a history no one talked about anymore. Others claimed they had heard unusual cries from the trees on the night of the disappearance, though no one wanted to admit it aloud. By the 3rd day, hope had started to fade from the eyes of even the most determined searchers. The realization that 3 children could simply vanish in broad daylight, within walking distance of home, wrapped the entire town in a quiet, suffocating fear that hinted at something far more unsettling than a simple case of missing kids. As the search for the Grayson children stretched into its 2nd day, something strange began happening deep inside Briarwood Forest, something that turned an already desperate search into a chilling mystery. The woods had always been dense, old, and somewhat intimidating, but the officers and volunteers who stepped into them that day felt a tension that none of them could quite explain. At first, they blamed exhaustion, or the stress of knowing 3 young siblings were still missing. But then the whispers started. It happened faintly at first, just as the morning sun filtered through the tangled branches, creating long, cold shadows over the forest floor. A search team moving along a narrow path paused when one of the volunteers swore he heard a voice, small, trembling, and distant, calling his name. He brushed it off as the wind, but the sound had been too clear, too shaped to be a harmless breeze. Minutes later, another team reported hearing something similar, a soft cry, almost like a child's, drifting between the trees. When they tried to pinpoint where it came from, the direction shifted, making it impossible to track. Sometimes it echoed ahead of them, sometimes behind, sometimes from both sides at once. The rescuers grew uneasy, exchanging looks they tried to hide from one another. Experienced trackers who had spent years in the woods claimed they had never heard anything like it. Sound did not behave that way in Briarwood. Sound didn't bend, or scatter, or circle a person like a whisper trying to lead them somewhere. The dogs brought in for the search reacted even more strangely. Their ears perked up at the invisible voices, their bodies stiffened, and instead of running toward the noises as trained, they cowered, growled, or backed away with tails tucked low. One handler had to drag his dog forward, but the animal resisted with such force that he finally gave up, shaken by the unusual behavior. As hours passed, the whispers grew more frequent. Some searchers thought they heard Lily calling for help. Others insisted they heard Noah crying. A few even claimed they heard Ben shouting warnings, his voice overlapping with the younger two, coming from impossibly different places at the same time. But no matter how fast they followed the sounds, they always led to the same outcome: emptiness. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, no torn fabric caught on branches. The forest swallowed every clue. Eventually, whispers began intertwining with faint giggles, soft humming, and quick breaths that felt too close to be natural. Searchers felt watched, followed, surrounded by something they couldn't see. A few refused to continue deeper, fear creeping under their skin as they realized these voices did not seem to be pleading for rescue. They sounded like they were guiding, luring, drawing anyone who listened further into the woods with an unsettling familiarity that didn't belong in the human world. As the search continued into the late afternoon of the second day, the teams pushed farther into the forest than anyone from Briarwood had gone in years. The trees grew older and thicker, their trunks twisted as if shaped by time and something far less natural. The air felt colder there, unnaturally so, and the sunlight dimmed beneath the canopy in a way that made even the bravest searchers uneasy. It was in this deep, forgotten stretch of Briarwood Forest that a group of officers stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there at all. One of the deputies, cutting through a wall of tangled brush, stopped so abruptly that the man behind him nearly collided with him. There, standing between two massive oak trees, was a cabin. Not a new one, not even an abandoned modern one, but a structure that looked as if it had been dropped from another century. The wood was dark and swollen with age, the roof sagging under layers of moss, and the windows smeared with decades of grime. The most unsettling detail, however, wasn't its condition. It was the fact that no one had ever mentioned a cabin in this part of the forest. There were no records of it, no stories from hunters or hikers, no sign that anyone had lived this deep in the woods for generations. It simply existed, silent and still, as if waiting for someone to notice it. The search team exchanged confused glances, their voices low and uncertain. One officer radioed the sheriff to confirm the area, hoping they had somehow wandered off the mapped grid, but the coordinates matched perfectly. According to every map the town had, there should have been nothing here but trees. The dogs refused to go near the cabin. They whimpered and backed away, pulling hard on their leashes, their eyes fixed on the structure with a fear the handlers couldn't ignore. Some of the volunteers instinctively stepped back as well, feeling something wrong radiating from the place, something old and watchful. The air around the cabin carried a strange stillness, as if the forest itself stopped breathing. A deputy, trying to appear braver than he felt, climbed the 3 creaking steps to the front door. Even before he touched it, he swore he felt a faint vibration through the wood, as though something inside was shifting. Another officer pointed out that no footprints or signs of recent movement surrounded the structure. It was as if no one had entered or left the cabin in decades, yet it had appeared exactly where the children's voices, the whispers the teams kept chasing, seemed to lead. With each second they stood before the weathered building, a heavy realization settled on the team. This cabin wasn't just forgotten. It wasn't just abandoned. It wasn't supposed to be here at all. Inside the cabin, the air felt heavier than it had outside, carrying a damp, ancient chill that clung to the skin like a warning. The deputies stepped in cautiously, their flashlights slicing through the murky darkness, revealing dust particles suspended in the air as if time itself had stopped moving. The floorboards groaned with every shift of weight, their echoes swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. At first glance, the cabin looked empty. No furniture, no belongings, no signs that anyone had lived there for decades. But as the light swept across the walls, the deputies froze. Covering nearly every inch of the interior were crude, childlike drawings, etched in shaky lines, and uneven strokes. They looked as if someone had used charcoal, dirt, or something far less identifiable to sketch them. Dozens of stick figures filled the space, arranged in awkward clusters, their thin limbs and round heads drawn with unsettling precision. In many of the drawings, groups of children stood inside circles, their simplistic faces devoid of expression. Surrounding them were dark, smudged shapes, tall, looming figures with elongated bodies and arms that stretched downward too far, almost to the ground. These shapes had no faces, only hollow, shadow-like forms that seemed to watch the children in every scene. The deputies moved closer, examining the drawings with mounting unease. Some of the figures were repeated, 3 small ones drawn consistently in the same positions relative to one another. A few of the officers muttered that the heights looked eerily similar to the Grayson siblings, though none dared say it with certainty. On another wall, a series of drawings showed what appeared to be the forest itself, the trees drawn with jagged lines leaning inward, as if closing around the children. In some depictions, the dark shapes blended into the tree line, indistinguishable from the trunks until one looked closely. One deputy knelt to inspect a corner where the drawings became more frantic, the lines thicker and more chaotic, as if done in haste or terror. The circle in this section was broken, and the stick figures inside were drawn as if running, their limbs extended in panicked directions. The tall shapes behind them appeared closer, almost towering over the fleeing children. Several officers exchanged looks, each silently questioning the same thing. Who drew these, and why would they cover every wall like a desperate message? The strangest part wasn't the drawings themselves. It was the fact that the charcoal-like lines looked fresh in some places, as if someone had touched them not long before the team arrived. A deputy brushed his thumb across one of the darker smudges and felt a soft, powdery residue cling to his skin. The cabin, abandoned or not, had been used, and whatever had happened inside these walls had involved children. The realization settled heavily in their minds that these drawings weren't merely illustrations. They felt like warnings, or perhaps attempts to retell something horrifying that the forest didn't want buried. The moment the Grayson children were found, the forest seemed to exhale, as if releasing something it had been holding tightly. It was late evening when a deputy near the eastern clearing spotted 3 small shapes emerging from between the trees. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The light was dim, the fog creeping low across the ground, and exhaustion had been eating away at every searcher for days. But as the figures drew closer, the shapes became unmistakably human. 3 children, walking slowly, unsteadily, their silhouettes barely upright. The deputy called out their names, his voice trembling with disbelief. Ben lifted his head first, his eyes wide and glassy, as if he had just woken from a deep and unsettling dream. Lily clung to his shirt, her small frame shaking with each step. Noah, the youngest, looked the most fragile, his feet dragging, his expression vacant. All 3 were barefoot, their skin pale as moonlight, and their clothes smeared with dirt and streaked with something darker that no one wanted to identify just yet. When they reached the clearing, the children didn't run to the officers or cry out for their parents. Instead, they simply stood there, silent, staring past the searchers as though trying to see something still lurking between the trees. Their silence unnerved the team more than any scream could have. Normally, missing children who reappear after days alone in the wilderness cling to whoever finds them, desperate and relieved. But the Grayson siblings acted as though they weren't certain they were truly back. Their breathing was shallow, their hands trembling, and when the deputy tried to kneel and speak to them, Noah flinched so violently it sent a ripple of alarm through everyone present. As more officers arrived, the children were gently wrapped in blankets and examined. Their feet were scratched and raw, yet no one could understand how they had managed to walk so far without leaving a trail. Their hair carried a faint smell of damp earth and wood smoke, something that didn't belong to any part of the forest the searchers had covered. When an officer whispered, "Where have you been?" only Lily reacted. She slowly turned toward him, her eyes unfocused, and said in a voice barely audible, "We followed the voices home." The words hung in the air like frost. None of the searchers moved, their breaths caught in their throats. The children had reappeared, but something about their return felt incomplete, as if they had brought a piece of the forest back with them, something unseen, something silently watching from the darkness behind the tree line. During the questioning that took place shortly after the children were brought to safety, the room carried a stillness so tense it felt almost alive. The Grayson siblings sat together on a long metal bench, wrapped in oversized blankets, their eyes drifting between the floor and the walls as if they were expecting something to move in the corners. Officials spoke gently, careful not to frighten them further, but the children's silence created a barrier thicker than any wall. It wasn't until a soft question was directed toward Noah, the youngest, the one who seemed the most shaken, that the atmosphere in the room shifted into something far darker. Noah had been staring at his hands for several minutes, his small fingers twitching restlessly, when an investigator crouched down to his level and asked what had frightened him the most in the woods. Noah didn't respond at first. He blinked several times, his pupils dilated, his breathing shallow and uncertain. Then, almost imperceptibly, he lifted his head. His eyes, once filled with the innocence of a child, held a distant, haunted look, as though he had seen something no child should ever witness. The room fell silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum more quietly. Noah's voice, when it finally came, was far too calm, too steady for someone his age. It carried a strange emptiness, a quiet conviction that froze everyone in place. "It wasn't us screaming," he said, as if stating a simple fact. "It was the ones who look like us." The words hit the investigators like a gust of cold wind. Several adults exchanged startled glances, unsure if they had heard him correctly. One of the officers leaned in, his face tightening as he asked Noah to repeat himself, hoping the child had simply misspoken. But Noah shook his head slowly, his gaze now fixed on the darkened window across the room, as though he expected to see his own reflection staring back with a different expression. He continued, his small voice cracking only once. He explained that throughout their time in the forest, they had heard crying and screaming that sounded exactly like them. Ben's voice begging for help, Lily's sobs echoing through the trees, Noah's own frightened wails calling for their mother. But the real Grayson children hadn't been the ones making those sounds. They had been hiding, holding each other tightly, listening as something mimicked them with uncanny precision, repeating their voices over and over until it felt like the forest itself was learning their emotions. Noah insisted they had seen figures between the trees, shapes that moved the way they did, breathed the way they did, even tilted their heads the same way. But they were not human. They were copies, or shadows, of the children, following them, watching them, calling out in their voices as if trying to draw them closer. As Noah finished speaking, the room felt impossibly colder. No one dared speak. Every adult present realized the chilling implication. Whatever had taken the children in those woods hadn't just hidden them. It had studied them, and it had learned how to sound exactly like them. As the officials continued their questioning, a deeper, more unsettling pattern began to emerge, one that none of them had expected. At first, the children's fragmented answers seemed like the confused memories of three siblings who had endured fear, exhaustion, and disorientation in the woods. But the more they spoke, the more the investigators realized the children weren't merely struggling to explain what happened. They were unable to remember entire stretches of time. When asked what they had eaten, where they had slept, or how they had survived for 3 days alone, all three of them stared blankly, as if the questions themselves belonged to a world they no longer recognized. Ben, normally confident and protective, faltered each time he tried to recall the first night in the forest. His brows furrowed, his lips parted, but no words came out. It was as if the memories dissolved the moment he reached for them. Lily fidgeted with the blanket around her shoulders, whispering that the dark parts wouldn't come back no matter how hard she tried. Noah simply said, "They didn't let us remember," before clamping his mouth shut again. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances. Children might forget details due to trauma, but for all three siblings to have identical gaps suggested something far stranger. And then their stories began to overlap in ways that no one could dismiss as imagination. All three remembered being watched, not by animals, not by strangers, but by versions of themselves. Ben recalled waking up, though he couldn't say when, to see someone who looked exactly like him crouching between the trees, staring with wide, expressionless eyes. Lily mentioned seeing two silhouettes that mirrored her and her brothers, standing close together as if whispering to one another. Noah, still trembling, said he saw the other Noah more than once, always a few steps ahead, always turning at the same angle he did, like a reflection caught in the wrong place. What terrified the officials most was the consistency in the details. The copies never blinked. They never spoke in front of the children. They only watched, tilting their heads slightly, as though comparing what they saw to something they already knew. When asked if these figures ever approached them, Lily shook her head violently. "They waited," she whispered. "They waited for us to forget where we came from." The children insisted that every time they tried to walk toward home, the forest shifted, pulling them deeper, and the copies appeared again, blocking paths or standing where the real siblings should have been. It felt, they said, like the forest wasn't just alive. It was learning, adjusting, correcting their movements as if conducting an experiment on them. By the end of the questioning, one truth settled heavily over the room. Whatever had taken the children had also taken pieces of their time, their memory, and something deeper, something that left them changed, hollowed in ways impossible to explain. And what they remembered most clearly was not being lost, but being observed by something that knew their faces better than they did. When the final revelations came from the Grayson children, they did not arrive as a single confession, but as fragments, pieces of a truth so unsettling that the officials interviewing them found themselves hesitating to write it down. The siblings, exhausted and trembling, explained that the copies they had seen throughout the forest did not simply mimic them from a distance. At some point, during a stretch of time they could not fully recall, the copies had tried to replace them. Ben was the first to speak of it. His voice was shaky, yet certain, as he described an unsettling moment when he woke to find himself lying on the forest floor with Lily and Noah still asleep beside him. Dawn was barely beginning to touch the treetops. The air felt cold, too still, and Ben sensed something watching him. When he turned, he saw another Ben standing only a few feet away. This version of himself had no scratches, no dirt smeared on its face, no visible fear. It looked calmer, cleaner, almost perfected. And it smiled, something the real children said the copies had never done before. That detail alone made the investigators shift uneasily. Lily then whispered that she had experienced something similar. She remembered feeling someone gently touch her arm in the dark, and when she opened her eyes, she saw a version of herself kneeling beside her. Its face was emotionless, its eyes focused and glassy. It raised a finger to its lips as if commanding her to stay silent. Noah shuddered as he added that he once reached for Ben's hand in the dark, only to realize a moment later that the hand he held was too cold, too smooth, almost rubbery. When he yanked his hand away, the figure matching his brother's outline faded backward into the shadows, leaving behind a whisper that sounded like an imitation of his own breath. What horrified the officials most was what the children said next. The forest, according to the siblings, was trying to decide which versions of them should leave. There were moments when the real children felt themselves drifting, losing awareness, as though something was testing how well they clung to their own identities. Lily described feeling pulled out of her head, as if her thoughts were being examined by something she couldn't see. Ben said he often couldn't tell if Noah's voice beside him was real or just another mimic trying to confuse them. Noah admitted that he no longer trusted his own reflection. He feared it might move differently if he looked too long. The children insisted that the copies were becoming more accurate with time, learning their gestures, their speech, even their breathing patterns. Eventually, the siblings realized that if they didn't escape, the forest would send something in their place, something that looked like them, sounded like them, and walked like them, but wasn't them at all. Their escape, as they described it, felt like luck or desperation. They said the copies watched them go but didn't follow, as if the forest hadn't finished deciding whether it wanted the originals or the replicas. When their story concluded, the officials in the room sat in stiff, horrified silence. There was no logical way to process what the children had experienced. But the terror in their voices, the trembling in their hands, and the perfect consistency of their accounts suggested one chilling possibility. The Grayson children had not simply survived the forest. They had survived being replaced.